Welcome to Ready Set Exec, the podcast where we sit down with executives across North America to unpack their business, leadership, and expertise.
And every other week, join us for Market Watch, all things hiring, real insights and no fluff.
I think you just raised a really important point. Data has become extremely more prevalent. In fact, we're all being fire hosed by data. 20 plus years ago, we didn't have the access to the data that we have today. Sometimes I miss those days where the data was a little bit less, coming at you, and you really had to work a little harder to figure out and how to make sense of it. But one of the key, I think, issues for most businesses today isn't, as you're pointing out, access to data. It's defining upfront the business outcomes so they know what data they need to inform their decisions. I think that's a critical distinction today. We're looking at so much data and we're trying to figure out what it means, but we don't have context. So if we don't have clear performance targets for your business, then the analytics becomes kind of a reporting exercise rather than a decision-making engine.
Hi, everyone. I'm here with Laura Patterson, entrepreneur, speaker, author, and board member. Widely recognized as an expert in customer-centric growth and marketing performance management. As president of VisionEdge Marketing, she is founded in 1999. She's helped hundreds of companies replace disconnected activities with intentional, measurable strategies that create customer and business value. Known for a pragmatic, data-informed approach, Laura created the Circle of Traction framework and authored the award-winning Fast Track Your Business book. She also holds a patent for Accelance, and a SaaS tool that links business results to implementation. Sought after speaker and advisor, she is passionate about helping organizations eliminate inefficiency and accelerate success through strategic clarity. Thanks for being here today, Laura.
Thank you for having me, John. It's a pleasure.
Yeah, and we were talking a little bit about, where organizations are failing to link their analytics or data capabilities, all these dashboards that people are building, but how are they linking them to real business outcomes? And I think there's a lot of failure there in terms of turning all that data to something actionable in terms of what their strategy is and how they run their business. What have you seen in the last 20 years in terms of how data has become more and more prevalent and how we're using it?
I think you just raised a really important point. Data has become extremely more prevalent. In fact, we're all being fire hosed by data. 20 plus years ago, we didn't have the access to the data that we have today. Sometimes I miss those days where the data was a little bit less, coming at you, and you really had to work a little harder to figure out and how to make sense of it. But one of the key, I think, issues for most businesses today isn't, as you're pointing out, access to data. It's defining upfront the business outcomes so they know what data they need to inform their decisions. I think that's a critical distinction today. We're looking at so much data and we're trying to figure out what it means, but we don't have context. So if we don't have clear performance targets for your business, then the analytics becomes kind of a reporting exercise rather than a decision-making engine. And so the failure is really in the translation, which is moving from data to insight to action, which is the goal. The whole point of why we want data is to be able to make actionable business decisions.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things I've seen in some companies is they roll out like this big PowerBI dashboard, and it's so fancy, and they spend a consultant's time to do all this. Then the dashboard comes out, everyone's oohs and ahs for a couple of weeks. Oh, look at all what we can track. And then a month later, it's like, have you looked in the dashboard lately? Nah, I don't know. I mean, what is they're more focused on the fires that they have to deal with rather than strategically planning, or they're like, well, how does this data really help me? I mean, okay, we know certain metrics, but I think that's where the alignment of KPI and actual planning your let's say your coaching strategy with your team, your forecasting, all those kind of things come into play. And what's the difference between like a vanity metric and a good metric? How do you decide what's worth following?
Well, you have a lot packed in that question. So I think it's important first, just a few definition of terms. A dashboard, when we talk about dashboards, we're talking about performance management dashboards. Otherwise, what a lot of people refer to as a dashboard is really just data visualization, taking data and putting into some chart or graph or something so we can kind of understand and what we're looking at in some way. So that's not necessarily going to help you manage performance or make decisions. It's just a collection of data in a visually representative way. And then measures, metrics, and KPIs. So all of those are a form of data. Measures come in a variety of formats. And typically, there's some way that you're quantifying something. Some measures we can control and some measures we can't, but it's a very, specific type of something, quantity of something. And to your point, often vanity measures are not a metric, but they're actually a measure, like how many fans, how many followers, how many likes. It's just a number, it's a quantity, right? And we can track that over time to see if there's any change in it, but it's just a vanity measure. A metric is a standard of measurement, and it usually requires some kind of calculation. And now there's a different kinds of metrics, and we can begin to think about outcome-oriented metrics versus operational metrics versus output metrics. And a good metric should be tied to the outcome. That's where you want to get. What is the outcome that the business is trying to achieve in order to declare success at some point in time? And then what is it your function in your organization is expected to do to help achieve that metric? And then how will you know that you did is what you're going to be measuring. Now you can actually create a good performance management dashboard, because now we can begin to get to why. We don't probably have time to talk about the difference between attribution models, performance management dashboards, campaign or program related scorecards, which are all different ways that we can visualize data. And then lastly, were those KPIs that you mentioned, which is really a type of a metric. And what I like to tell people is a KPI is a metric you're willing to spend money on to change. And the best way to think about those is that you want them at the organizational level, not at the functional level. That's where your metrics are. Everybody should be working toward the same KPIs. That could be category ownership. It could be a product adoption rate. It could be customer lifetime value. It depends on what the outcome is. That's going to set your KPI. So if you want to have more accountability in the organization, you really have to have these clear, measurable business outcomes, because that's what's going to help you figure out how each organization is going to be measured.
Yeah, so two things about that. So I agree. Working backwards is usually the way to do it. I know, for example, in sales, this is an easy example for people that are listening. It's like in sales, we say, listen, we need one new customer a month. So we say, what's your close rate? 30%? Okay, so you need 3 meetings a month. To get 3 meetings, how many calls do you have to make? We know on calls you were about 10% to convert. So you need to multiply it out, 300 calls that month to get those 10 meetings, to get the 3 closes and get the 1 customer, right? So you work backwards to do that. How would that apply? And let's just take one example just to make it simple. For example, attribution models, which is my favorite topic, because internally for us as well, figuring out attribution when you're in so many different channels, doing so many different activities, from cold email to outreach to socials to events, all these different things, being able to create attribution for that to see ROI is difficult, because you're like, you can't track necessarily what interactions everyone had, right? So how do you build an attribution model, let's say, with the outcome of, bringing in new customers, or, tracking also conversion with the different channels, and being able to say, okay, well, this is what's working, this is what's not. That's probably something that a lot of companies do have some trouble with, and I've heard that from quite a few.
So if we think about an attribution model, let's use an example that everybody can relate to. Let's not make it too specific just to selling, but I'm going to use golf as an example, because a lot of people have played golf or at least know what golf is. I'm married to someone who enjoys golf regularly. My father was a golfer, so even though I don't play, I've been surrounded by golf metaphors most of my life. So when you go to play golf, a round of golf, you're given a scorecard for that round, which is basically tells you information about that course and what a good par or is for every hole. And you are then That's the performance target. And then you are playing that hole. If you're playing with others, you're competing with others on each hole, and you're tracking how you did per hole to get a score at the end of the game, which depending on how you're have set it up with your buddies that you're playing with, what that results in. That is a scorecard. That's what happens when you run campaigns for a company, that is multi-touch campaigns, right? It doesn't matter. This is what we need to have in each one of those holes in order to move the opportunity to the end, which is the scorecard. The dashboard for golf tells you why you got that, because your scorecard is not going to tell you anything about why you got the score you got. It's just going to tell you how you scored at each hole. So it could be, putts per green. It could be greens in regulation. It could be any number, fairways to non-fairway drives, whatever it might be. That's something you're going to set up so you understand why you got the score you got. And that dashboard is probably going to be beyond that one game. That might be for an entire season, right? The next thing after that is attribution. And that's going to take you to which clubs were you using to get the results? What was happening maybe in things you couldn't control, like the weather or other course conditions related to, that are not in your control. So when you're looking at building an attribution model, you're looking at the factors that impacted the results. So if you can think in those terms, you build your attribution model, understanding the kinds of factors that affect the outcome. And so you're not really thinking only in terms of which channel, because they all are interrelated. It's not just one factor. So your attribution model should be accounting for all of the factors. So you can then say, I need to fix my club choice when I am on courses like this that have these conditions at this distance, or I need to change how I approach or my stance or how I'm swinging when I'm doing A, B, and C, or whatever it might be. That's the beauty of the attribution model. So if maybe that metaphor will help people think about it. It's not just going to be one thing that makes a difference in the game.
Yeah, no, it totally makes sense. And I think thinking about that whole process helps as well. Thinking about, breaking down, as you said, it's breaking down the golf game to different aspects of it to see where's the most friction in the system? Where are you lagging behind? The weakest link in the chain, or the critical path, we would say, right? Mm-hmm. So totally get that. Where do you see that customers are failing, though, in terms of, when I say customers, your clients, right? In terms of using data, I mean, are they just they're not thinking of the outcomes at all? They're stuck on certain metrics that they believe to be important, and when you break it down to the golf game, you figure out that it's not as important as they thought because it's not part of the critical path. Let's say, what is the major mistakes that people are doing when they're looking at their dashboards or trying to plan this, because it's not always as you don't know what you don't know, right?
Yes. So I think you bring up a good point, knowing what are the right questions that you need the answers to. I think, again, trying to go into all the data and figure out something is perhaps not the best approach for many companies who don't have large groups of people, even though we have AI today and large language models, and we can put a lot of information in and crunch it. You have to ask the right prompt. You need to know what the questions are that you need the answers to. And many times the questions that leaders need to be asking should be more about the customers that they're trying to serve or want to serve than just about their business, because customer value creates business value, and business value creates shareholder value. So I think really understanding what the right questions are to begin with is where you start. Having a good plan that's well defined, has clarity around those outcomes, and then not getting sucked into random acts along the way of planning. And that the dashboard that you're creating, back to this dashboard and scorecards, need to tie back to the plan so that you can really see, as we say in Texas, are you moving the ball down the field? Because if you're not making progress toward the results that you're trying to achieve, even no matter what your numbers are, it doesn't really matter.
Totally makes sense. And that kind of is a good segue into sort of thinking about customer centricity, right?
Yes.
And, I think there's a differentiation between customer centric companies and customer focused companies, in terms of like the wording. I think that's something that's evolved over the last 20 years when people say they're customer aware or they have a whole customer centricity framework that you've built. Love to sort of dive into that a little bit in terms of what that looks like and what that means for a business right now, especially in 2026, going into the new year here, where there's all these new tools, but then we still got to focus on the customer. So how do we do that with all these new gadgets that we have?
I think we have to put customer centricity in context, in relationship to what? So let's start with that. Customer centricity in relationship to product centric versus sales centric versus market centric. So if we think about those frameworks, those ways of running your company, let's kind of parse that out. Product centric companies are often, if we build it, they will come. It doesn't mean they're not creating something of value. It's just about where their energy is going inside their company. And you really know those companies because you can look and see how much money they're spending in R&D, right? And so they're always thinking about how to be ahead of the market and how to be the disruptors in the market. That's not necessarily a customer centric company. That doesn't mean they're not creating value. And there's nothing necessarily wrong with that, but they're not making decisions based on creating customer value. They're making decisions around innovation for business value, right? Sales centric companies, you kind of know those companies because that's where it's all about making a number inside a company. And you know that sales is going to sell whatever they need to sell to make the number, even if there are things that the company doesn't yet have or maybe doesn't even produce. And they'll make offers or discounts and bundle things that may or may not go together just so they can get a deal, right? It's all about the number. And they are making promises to customers, but if you can't deliver on those customers, they're certainly not a customer-centric company. Then you kind of have the market-centric companies. Those are like kissing cousins to product-centric companies. The difference is they're waiting to ride a wave and they're going to strike while the iron is hot. And we can see that in all kinds of technology evolutions, right? The ones who were out front with cloud computing and then everyone who came on after, or the ones who were out front with cybersecurity and everybody who came thereafter. And the ones now that came out with AI and everybody that came thereafter. These are market-centric companies, and they're just trying to draft the wave and they're not necessarily about being the first, but they're going to try and grow their category in the category and grow their market share in the category. A customer-centric company is thinking about the decisions they're making for the business in the context of how it will create value for the customer and that will return in value to the business. So the customer is at the heart of the decisions the company is making at every turn. It doesn't mean that you're catering to every customer's whim. That's maybe more of a sales-centric company, right? It means that you're thinking about, will this create more value? Will it allow us to, do we have the strategies, the metrics, and investments in place that will create measurable customer value that will in turn create business value?
Yeah. I guess the big part of that is making sure, one, we know exactly who our customers are. We've developed their personas to the extreme level, so we really know. We've done focus groups. I mean, what would you recommend for a company starting off with this kind of framework? I mean, you do need to spend a lot of time to figure out who exactly are our customers, where do they play, and know everything about them, right? Their whole customer journey and so on, right? So
right, and that's what we talk about in Fast Track Your Business, which is using our framework, the circle of traction, and it all starts with customer insights. And what do we know about our customers? Have we validated that? What is it we need to know about our customers? How are we going to get that information? How will we use that information to make decisions for the business and for our customers? So the very beginning part of that growth wheel and the very first spot is customer insights. Of course, you can't do that well if you don't have the right culture in place, you don't have the data in place, you don't have people with the skills in place, right? You have to have those things, the systems and the processes in order to do that well. And that's a company that is, asking questions all the time and learning all the time, because customers change, their needs change, and really understanding the customer's customer. Like in the B2B world, when you're selling to a business, that's great. You're trying to solve their problem, but what problem are they trying to solve? Or what aspiration are they trying to achieve? What is the aspiration of their customers? So thinking not just about the very next person in the line, but the companies in the line thereafter, that would be where a company would want to have more information.
So where do you see the biggest capability gaps when we're looking at all these customer facing teams? Where are they failing? Where are they not making sure that they're customer centric? I mean, it's hard to get the whole organization. This is also part of culture building, I imagine, too, is
Yes.
really getting everyone aligned.
I want to say they're failing. I would say that there's lots of room for improvement, even those that are good at it. And it's usually around process, right? That's where, having really well-defined processes that are customer-centric in nature, and being able to support customer-centric decisions. So, a lot of companies have well-defined processes, and then when things happen, they don't necessarily revisit their processes in order to adjust to ensure that they are making changes in line with the direction that the customers are heading, or what the customers are going to kind of really need to be able to do. So the processes need to be defined, but they also need to be able to evolve. And I think that's where a lot of people, they get them written out, and that's the way it is, and that becomes how we're going to do business. But we live in a very dynamic environment, and we have to be able to be flexible and agile, as well as process oriented.
The next question about customer centricity in the age of AI, because I mean, I know as a consumer myself, the integration of AI bots and all that is off-putting. I don't like it. I want to talk to a human as much as possible if I'm dealing with a company. You go to the website and the chat pops up. Everyone's using an AI chatbot on their websites now, and it's like, well, I just want to get to a human so that I can get my problem solved, rather than them going through the question tree, right? What is your problem about? What did you do? What happened? Does this help? They give you some fact sheets to read. I'm like, customer service, get me through to the real human. So what do you think about that with AI, and how do we adapt that into our framework? Because everyone wants to use it for efficiency, but it also has its effect, right?
Well, John, I think you're absolutely right. In the end, we do all want to talk to human beings for the most part. Although maybe, there are parts of our parts of our communities that maybe are very, very comfortable with technology. But the AI chatbot thing is not the first time that we have been removed from engaging with a human being. Let's go back in time. Let's rewind the clock for a moment, and then we'll go forward and we'll come back and answer your question. Way back when I was a young girl, my mother would go and get gas, and there was an actual person that filled up her tank, checked her windshield fluid to make sure that we had fluid for windshield wipers for rain, checked the oil, and checked the tire pressure. I know people may be really surprised to know that that is what it used to be like. So what happened going forward? Now you go to the gas station and there's no human being. You do all that yourself. Now it can be more efficient, and you can control your time, and there's maybe more convenience. But what ended up happening is that in many cases, gas stations have become a commodity. If you would begin, so I just want to share with people to think about what is happening when you become so self-service oriented. You become potentially setting yourself up to become a commodity. When you call someone, let's wind the clock forward. Now we don't have people at gas stations. So now you go forward, and you used to walk into offices that had people to meet and greet you. Now you walk in and there's a kiosk, right? And one more human being removed from the interactions. But that person was really the director of first impressions. They're making that first impression of your company. Now you have a kiosk. That's the impression you have of the company. So what have we done to the relationship we're building with your customers, if that's the way it works? Automated voice. When you pick up, call phone and press this, press that, press this, press that. And all you're looking for is, how do I get to a person to talk to solve my problem? And I'm going through, 15 steps to try and find a human being. So I think people need to think carefully about automation when it comes to engaging with customers. That may work in some ways internally, although I'm not sure it does necessarily work well internally. But there may be some efficiencies, like the gas station situation. But what are you doing in terms of commoditizing your company as a result? So now what you're hearing is companies going back to, you can talk to a real human being. When you call us, you get a real human being. When you do X, you get to talk to you engage with a real person. That's becoming a differentiator. So maybe in a way, I'm trying to give you the answer. AI has its role for all of us, and we're going to all figure out how to use it in a way that we use a telephone or anything other tool that we might have found to help us be more proficient, more efficient, the way we use Zoom or some other virtual meeting capability, right? All of those are tools, and AI is going to become that tool. It shouldn't be a replacement for human interaction. And just like the tool isn't a replacement, it should be an enhancement to the interaction, not a replacement of the interaction. Did I answer your question?
Yeah, no, that totally makes sense. And yeah, I guess we have to think about, is the efficiency gains worth the change in the interaction with our customers, and how will our customers perceive that, change? So doing a trial of that is probably a good idea before you roll it out across the whole company. A good example for me was McDonald's. When I went into the drive-thru, it actually dialed overseas, and there was an overseas person taking my order in the drive-thru at the restaurant. And that person was basically in a call center taking my drive-thru order. Then when I go to the actual kiosk to get the food, it was, someone local making the food and doing it. But they had outsourced their drive-thrus. The order was wrong. I was like, what is going on here? There was like, you could hear it dialing and all this. Like it took longer to make the order, and then there was some language barrier a bit with the orders, and stuff like that. And I was like, this is wild. I'm like, this is like,
that is totally wild, because I haven't been to a McDonald's in a very, very long time. So I have to admit, surprise, but I can't even imagine, right? And when you think about a local McDonald's, again, think about your community that you're in. You're a local McDonald's who used to hire kids. What was that old saying? Like 1 in 8 people have worked at a McDonald's.
yeah.
You would go through the drive-through, and in a small town, you would know who that kid was, right? Hi, so-and-so, right? Or if you were kids driving to the drive-thrus because so-and-so was working that night. I mean, this goes back to really understanding what kind of customer experience you're creating. Now we're into customer experience. And is that the real customer experience that you want to have your customers talk about, right? Is that the customer experience you want to have your customers be talking about? I think in the end, that's one of the questions you should be asking. What kind of customer experience do we want our customers to be talking about? And if that's not what they're talking about, then we're missing the boat.
I think that's one of those failures of thinking about efficiency and cost savings, because they can, do it for half the price. Let's say the person that would be taking the orders to, what did that do to the customer experience for the whole restaurant? Needless to say, that trial period of them doing that, they stopped it. It was just a small trial they did in my area, but I was shocked. I was like, what is going on here? And there was a disconnect between the restaurant and what the orders were made, and the mistakes. There was quite a few mistakes you could see in the cars ahead and whatnot. I just use an example as like, wow, that was shocking to me as a consumer. And because we're like, why wouldn't they just have the same person that's giving you the food take the order, and like they used to? Why, so that was crazy. But that's something I think we could all relate to.
I think a little bit of customer research might have saved them from going all the way to a trial.
Yeah.
So that's where customer research, I think a lot of companies have not. I can't speak to McDonald's because they are usually pretty good at doing customer research, but many companies have kind of aren't doing customer research any longer or market research. They're going into their handy dandy AI tool thinking they're going to get what they need. That's not market research. That's not customer research. That's interesting stuff to do, but real customer centric companies do real customer and market research.
Yeah, I mean, I could definitely be all behind that. I used to teach marketing at the college, and marketing research was one of the courses. And without proper data to make decisions, without focus groups and all those kind of things, like you'll find out right away just by having a couple focus groups. It's like spare yourselves the damage it can cause, and we've seen some very large marketing issues this year. Like a good example for me was Cracker Barrel. Like, did they not talk to their customers before changing the logo? And it wasn't just a logo; it was the interior. I saw the photos of the interior. Right, it went from a folksy kind of old school country store kind of look inside to this kind of modern. They try to modernize it and bring in new customer base, and it failed pretty hard. I mean, I guess every company's trying to reinvent themselves at some point, but should have maybe gone to the customers to see what they thought about it. There's that nostalgic feel. I guess that's why you go into that restaurant. You like that old school feel.
And sometimes when you need to make shifts, and maybe Cracker Barrel does eventually need to make a shift as it wants to reach new markets, it's not a 0-1. It might have to be evolutionary in the way it goes. Maybe they're trying to, like here in Texas, compete with Buc-ee's, right? So you go into a Buc-ee's and that looks totally different. You probably don't know what that is, but that is a destination rest stop, okay, all over Texas. And maybe you're a Cracker Barrel and trying to compete with that, and you're looking at what Buc-ee's is doing, and you're trying to figure out how you can compete with that. That's great. You've understand maybe what the competition is, and you've done some competitive research. Now, how do you get your customer base to embrace the changes you want? So you might need to do that in an evolutionary way, as opposed to a 0-1. Anyway, that's a whole nother conversation, but I think the Cracker Barrel example will be something that will end up in case studies in the future.
Well, and each of these examples has their media cycle as well. That's another big thing, I think, with the modern times is when there's a mistake, let's say, in the market, everybody hears about it. It's in the news cycle for a week. The publicity, I mean, in some cases, the publicity could actually be good thing, but in marketing, we used to say there's no bad publicity. Any publicity is good publicity, right? But
American Eagle would agree with you on that. Another case study.
You have to have ability to take some risks in the market. I think that's another big thing, which some companies are playing it too safe, with some of the things they're doing. So they're playing it too safe. And I mean, I guess if you're a publicly traded company, you're more risk averse just because, there's the fiduciary responsibility, but I get that. So that kind of goes right into our leadership and culture piece here, in terms of how do you build a culture of accountability to drive performance without being too heavy-handed or punitive to people? I think it's definitely something you work on.
Well, I think that this goes back to having clarity right out of the gate on what are the business outcomes for the company that are tied to its mission and purpose. So are those plans, and I know a lot of people have all different kinds of language with all different kinds of systems, but let's just get really just basic. What does your company need to achieve in X period of time in order to declare success? What does that look like? Which customers does it need to have continue to do business with it? Which customers does it need to expand business with? Which new customers or customer segments does it need to acquire? Which products are going to help them do that? Really clear ideas on what that success is and quantifiable, measurable terms that the entire organization understands. So there's no ambiguity, because where you run into trouble is when you have ambiguity. Because if people understand this is what we need to do to win, and everyone understands how they are contributing, what their role is in order to achieve that result, then you don't have to be punitive, because you're going to be asking the question every day in your huddle, what are you doing today to help achieve this outcome? How did what you did yesterday move the ball down the field? What do you need help in order to move the ball down the field, right? You can have very clear conversations. So leaders need to be able to connect the roles of every person in their organization to an outcome. Every person should walk in every day and know exactly what those outcomes are. So you should be able to answer the question when they walk in the door, what are the 3, what are the 5? And there shouldn't be lots of them. Outcomes this company needs to achieve in order to declare success. And every role should connect to that. And every measure should connect to that, so that these are learning tools, not weapons, right? Now we're looking at our data, our measures from that perspective. And of course, leaders need to model the way, right? They have to be just as accountable and just as focused, and not get sucked into the random acts vortex, constantly changing, what the priorities are, and coming up with random things that people don't understand how that's connected to the outcome. They have to be much clearer about communicating, because if they get sucked into random acts and they start issuing various random acts, then that will destroy this momentum that you're trying to create in the culture.
Oh, that makes sense. When we're building our teams, and there's a lot of disruption right now in the market, right? So what do you think differentiates the resilient teams from those that are having trouble with this disruption that's coming right now?
I think focus, discipline, right? I think those are always important. I think a lot of organizations don't have a lot of discipline. I think frameworks, working from real frameworks, being clear about why they're doing things, that's, back to focus. Those, I think, are where the challenges are. And if your leadership team and the board don't have that kind of clarity, then I think you end up floundering. Being, too willing to make moves because you're trying to appease something, as opposed to it's actually designed to achieve something. So I think is important. How is what we're doing going to help us achieve, versus is this something to appease? And that is a very different kind of culture when you're working from appeasing versus achieving.
Maybe we can discuss a little bit about the discipline frameworks. What processes and what discipline frameworks are we using to accelerate this growth in the business, right? So I know you've built your framework that you use with your clients and so on. Can you just sort of riff on that a little bit in terms of how that looks, and how do you apply discipline to that, right? Like, we talk about discipline in business. What does that mean to you with this framework?
Whether it's a framework we've created or a framework someone else has created, it doesn't matter to me. I think having frameworks is really important, because when you work from a framework, you can have everybody in the organization understand. They can relate. They have a common vocabulary. They get processes put in place. But I think when I'm talking about discipline, that means the key levers, whether that's customers or value or performance metrics, that are going to move the business forward. So you're using scenario planning, which is a framework, right? You're understanding what value is to your customers and to your customer's customer. You are making decisions based on data, not random acts. These are all things that are important. Our frameworks, we have several. One is the circle of traction, which is in Fast Track, which outlines very clearly how to move your organization and accelerate growth with a customer-centric approach. Accelance, which is our software, helps you build up from outcomes down to activities, logic, and data chains, so everything is in alignment, and every plan syncs up to those outcomes, and the measures are related, and the budgets are allocated by outcomes, so you know exactly how your money is being invested in those outcomes. And you can look at your tasks and your dashboard in the context of those outcomes that you're trying to achieve. So those are examples of frameworks, and there are many other frameworks that are out there. They're all different kinds. I think just find what works best for your organization and the culture that you're trying to create. Stick to one. Don't keep changing around. I think that's another challenge that a lot of companies have. They try something for a little while. It doesn't quite get them where they want to go. And then they abandon that and they jump onto the next thing. And then, that they try for a little while and that doesn't get them quite where they want to go. And they abandon that and they jump on the next thing. And the entire organization says, oh, here comes the next thing.
Yeah. Oh, I can totally relate to that.
Right.
Yeah.
And so don't worry, then and the rest of the organization, oh, don't worry, in 6 months or 8 months, there'll be a next thing, right? So don't do that to your organization. That's a form of randomness. Be deliberate and disciplined and take it, be willing to commit for a period of time, because it takes a while for things to integrate into an organization, take root, and produce the fruits of your labor. And it's not going to be overnight. Almost never is it overnight.
Well, the failures that I've seen in terms of bringing in a new thought process or framework or whatever you're going to do is the change management aspect from leadership. They fail at it. So they have the idea, they bring it in. There's a big meeting, right? A big rollout. There's training, all that for the first week. Everyone's excited. Management's like, this is the way forward, right? All those big podium speeches you hear. And then what ends up happening after that is the employee buy-in is not there. And so then it becomes almost a punitive thing where it's like, oh, you have to be doing it this way, because that's what all the line managers are saying. Well, this is how it's done now, guys. You got to do it. And you don't, without the employee buy-in on the plan, I think it's almost like working backwards. Same thing with your outcomes thing is, are employees going to be able to, one, use this either technology or framework or whatever it is in their day-to-day? Is there pushback? Because there's always a certain amount of pushback for any kind of change that you bring into an organization, right? But, getting their buy-in, I think it should be job one from leadership. Because once you have their buy-in, then you get advocates within the employee group where they are like, oh, look how I used it and I was able to save time. And they tell their coworkers, Jim's doing great by using this new system. Let's get Jim to show us. And then you have these little subject matter experts. I think that's one thing we implemented when we were doing this kind of change management, was creating subject matter experts within the regular employee group to be able to be advocates for this change as well. Not just leadership top down, forcing everybody to implement it. But it's also training and consistency. And you're right, it takes time. If you think perfect examples like Workday, bringing Workday into a company and, the transitions we've seen for large organizations, 1, 2, 3 years until it's finally not only working properly, but that everyone's like, oh, I didn't know that you could do this in it, or I didn't know it was for this, or, oh, I never log in, right? You can actually pull and see who's logged in to see that 80% of the workforce never even bothered logging into the system before. It's wild. So I get what you're saying in terms of getting things, taking the time, building it out and whatnot.
I think you're bringing up a really good point, John, about change management. Having a change management plan and recognizing it's not just the announcement or launch, but actually what is our change management plan over, what are we doing the first 3 months, the next 3 months, the next 3 months, the next 3 months, over a course of 2 years or 3 years? And what are the milestones along the way that show that it's taking root? And if we haven't reached those milestones along the way, whether that's user adoption, logging in, or getting good customer or employee stories or customer stories, if it's internal, whatever it might be, getting customer champions what are those specific milestones that are indicators that it's taking root, right? What are we looking for that the plant that we're planting is actually taking root? And, we're seeing leaves sprouting and branches growing and things like that. If you're not seeing those things, then something's wrong. What do we need to do, right? Do we need to change out, frequency of watering? Do we need to add some nutrients? You have to think like that when you're planting a new or bringing in a new framework. You need to think of it like you're nurturing a plant.
No, that totally makes sense. I think a lot of companies are not doing that, though. They're thinking more of the top down. Well, we rolled it out and everybody's got to do it. That's just the way it is, right? That's the old school kind of mentality of do what you're told.
Well, you can do that. You can put the plant in the ground, and don't do a good job, it'll be dead in a season. So that's what happens with these initiatives. If you're not thinking, to your point, of a good change management plan to support the growth right? They're taking root of the new initiative.
Definitely some things to think about for sure. I appreciate having you on today.
Thank you. I hope everybody takes away at least one useful idea from today.